Hi folks, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to manage your e-commerce transactions in QuickBooks. And I'm specifically going to show you how to do that with an app called Synder, Syndr.com. And the reason why you're going to need to use a third-party app like Synder, especially when you have multiple channels, Amazon, Shopify, Etsy, eBay, PayPal, Square, Stripe, whatever you have, you want that information to come in a uniform fashion into QuickBooks. If you don't use an app like Synder, you're going to have transactions integrated into QuickBooks in all different funky ways, and it's going to be nearly impossible to reconcile after you download those transactions. So in order to have the data in a uniform way so you can reconcile in the future and have a tight set of books, you want to use Synder. Trust me about that. Now I'm going to click here under the integrations button so you can see all the channels that Synder integrates with. We have Shopify, Amazon, eBay, WooCommerce, BigCommerce, Walmart, Home Depot, Best Buy, etc. So if you are selling through any of these channels, you can use Synder to aggregate all the data in there. Also, if you're selling through other channels not listed here, but they're using payment processors like Stripe, Square, PayPal, and others, you can also integrate that data. One really cool thing about Synder is there's the ability to integrate your Excel data. So if your channel is not listed here, but you happen to be able to export a spreadsheet worth of transactions, you can import them through Synder and have one unique place where all the transactions are. All right, so I'm going to go into QuickBooks Online and show you how you can add the Synder app into your QuickBooks Online accounting software. So once you log into QuickBooks Online, you're going to click on Apps on the left-hand side, and you're going to search Synder, Syndr. Once you find Synder in there, you're going to click on where it says Get App Now, and then it's going to take you through the authorization process for you to connect the app. Then you're going to click on Connect, and then you will see your Synder app open up. And then I already had an account set up, but in your setting, when you do that, it's going to ask you for a whole bunch of information that you need to walk through while the account is set up. But after you set up the account and your QuickBooks Online is connected, now it's going to be time to connect your channels. So I'm going to click here where it says Add Payment Platform, and I'm going to click on the drop-down menu, and then I'm going to click on PayPal, and then I'm going to click on Connect. Then I'm going to log in into PayPal. Click on Login. And grant permission. Perfect. I successfully connected my PayPal account into Synder. Let me add another platform here. I'm going to click on Add Payment Platform. Click on the drop-down menu. And now I'm going to select Shopify. Click on Connect. And once you're logged in into Shopify, you'll be able to just click on Install App and authorize the Synder app to connect to Shopify. Perfect. Now I'm going to connect eBay. So I'm going to click on Add Payment Platform, click on the drop-down menu, go down to eBay, click on Connect, click on I agree once I log into my eBay account, and I successfully connected eBay. Now I'm going to add the Excel option as well. So I'm going to click on the drop-down menu here, click on Excel, and then I'm going to call it Excel Import. So if, for example, you have a special type of shopping cart and it doesn't work with Synder, you can call it X cart or whatever it's called in there so you know. For the time being, I'm just going to call it Excel Import because it might come from different channels. We'll talk more about the Excel Import option as a choice afterwards, but I'm going to create it anyway. Then very important question, and we'll go back to the setting of the other channels to discuss that as well, is going to tell me which of your QuickBooks bank accounts would you like those sales that are importing from Excel to be imported into. Let's say I'm going to send it to this Chase 5150 checking and click on Continue. We actually get to set up those accounts in every one of the platforms. So I'm going to click on Configure here for my Shopify, and you'll see that as I go through the settings, and I'm not going to go through all the settings, I just want to give you a general idea for what you have here in terms of options. But if you watch me go to the settings, it will ask me which account or which bank account would you like your Shopify payments to reconcile through your QuickBooks. So in this case, I created an account called Shopify Bank just for that, or Synder created that for me. And then it tells me payment method. So when those sales receipts and payments are downloaded, they should be labeled payment method Shopify. That's also important for reports in the future. So you actually get to choose for every one of the accounts what bank account, what clearing account would you like to use for each of these platforms. Now, this is the general setting. So if it doesn't belong to any of these special transactions, like a manual order or an other order, a POS order or something like that, it will default to that. But you can actually have a set of settings based on the specific type of transaction that it gets processed. And every single platform has its own type of transaction types that you can add in there. Now I'm going to go back into that. I'm going to show you the example with PayPal, how you can see that as well. But I'm going to click on sales here so you can see all the other options. This is where you can change some of these settings and have Synder choose how the data comes into QuickBooks. For example, instead of bringing the transactions as sales receipts, you can choose for them to come in as invoices and payments as well. So if you have it off, they come in as sales receipts, which is a default option. If you have it on, they come in as invoices and payments, which is a secondary option. All right, we're going to go back to those settings a little bit later on. I'm going to go back for a second and open up the PayPal settings just so you can kind of see what kind of options we have here. I'm going to click on configure and notice that in PayPal, there's a default set of settings. And again, you could choose how the data comes in, what bank accounts need to be hit, whether or not you're going to do product mapping. That's for inventory sync. So Synder will read the name of the product that's being sold, and you actually have the option to map your QuickBooks inventory item with a specific item that's being sold through PayPal in this particular case. Then you have whether or not you want taxes to be added into it, how the fees are going to be added. You could choose what account you want the fees to be published into or booked into once the fees get downloaded, because Synder will download both the sales transaction and the feed. Then the expenses, whether or not you want QuickBooks to create a vendor for each expense you run through PayPal, for example, or if you want it to be a generic vendor, and you can just click a generic, choose a vendor from the vendor list or create a generic vendor, or turn that off and have PayPal and Synder create a vendor for each expense transaction that's being run through PayPal. Then, how you want to manage transfers and what bank accounts the transfers are going to be booked into, and the multi-currency settings, which we're not going to get too much into detail in this video. So I'm going to click on back, and you saw how every one of these channels, Shopify, PayPal, eBay, they all have their own configurations. Now I'm going to add one more. I'm going to add my Stripe account as well, because I forgot to do that. So I'm going to click on the drop-down menu and then click on Stripe and click on Connect. So I'll go ahead and connect my Stripe account. All right, perfect. I was able to connect my Stripe account as well. So enough of the boring stuff, but trust me, this is kind of where the sausage is made in these settings. This is really the most important part, because this is where you're going to tweak, how the data will flow into QuickBooks. It's a little bit of more of an advanced concept. You might need an accountant or someone that really understands how QuickBooks functions to make sure that this back-end setup is done correctly. However, let's go to sort of the fun part where we can see all the transactions that were downloaded from all the channels and how data gets synced up. So right now, what you're seeing here is all the transactions that were downloaded from all the channels. This is a list of all the transactions that were synced into Synder. And then you're going to see here in green, it would say sync if they already have been sent to QuickBooks. If it's not green and it doesn't say synced, that means it has not been sent to QuickBooks yet. Now I'm able to filter and only see transactions from specific areas. So for example, if I click here on PayPal, I'm only going to see my PayPal transactions. If I click on Shopify, I'm only going to see my Shopify transactions. If I click on eBay, I didn't have any eBay transactions recently, so that will be all my eBay transactions. And if I click on Stripe, I get to see all my Stripe transactions. Now, once the transactions are synced into QuickBooks, you're able to click here where it says show details, and you're able to see more details about that sync. So for example, I'm gonna look at this transaction for $250, and I'm gonna click right here where it says show detail, and I'm gonna get to see sort of the details of this transaction. So right here, it tells me this is a transaction from Shopify. Actually, this was from Stripe, and this transaction came in as a sales receipt. And if I click here where it says show in QuickBooks, if I click on that link, it will then open up the specific transaction in QuickBooks. So QuickBooks created a sales receipt with the customer information, with the payment amount based on that payment that came in through Stripe. Now notice here that QuickBooks created a item called Stripe product. That's probably because there's no details in Stripe on that particular transaction. There's no details, so Synder will create a generic item called Stripe product. That's kind of how it works. That's all that stuff gets controlled through the settings. Customer information comes in, customer email comes in, all that stuff comes in straight into QuickBooks, and it goes into whichever bank account you have it synced into. So for example, there's a bank account in QuickBooks called Stripe bank account, and this is the one that gets reconciled to zero at the end of the period. If I go back into Stripe here, I'm going to go back into the settings and then go into my Stripe settings. I kind of want you to see how this whole workflow works. I'm going to open up here my Stripe configuration. I'm going to click into sales, and notice that the payment itself comes into Stripe bank account, and then the payment type is Stripe. These two settings, these two drop-down options are the ones that get to manipulate how the data flows into QuickBooks ultimately. So if I open up that transaction, I'm going to go here to transactions. I'm going to filter that again up here and choose only Stripe, and then look at that transaction again, just so we can see what that looks like. Let me go ahead and click on show in QuickBooks. You're going to notice that those two settings, right, the payment type and the bank that the money was deposited into, it's pushed in here correctly. Now, a lot of people, when they first see this, they're like, what is Stripe bank account? Why isn't that going to your Bank of America or your Chase, where the actual money lands into eventually? And the reason for that is because Stripe actually is syncing in the payment and the expense or the transaction fee. So what it does is it flows the payment into this account called Stripe Bank, which is a clearing account, and the payment and the expense gets cleared in there, and then the difference, which is eventually what makes it to your bank account, it's what gets transferred. So let me show you. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and then I'm going to go into my chart of accounts, and I'm going to go into that Stripe bank account. I'm going to click on View Register, and you're going to notice that the account gets zeroed out at some point. So as you go down the list here, at some point this account gets zeroed out. That's called reconciliation. Now, right now it's not at zero because there's a payment, and the transfer of that payment into the bank hasn't happened yet. So there's a balance there. Once the transfer happens, it will zero out. But for example, on that particular transaction for $250, here's where the payments coming into, here's where the sales coming into for $250, and here's where my transaction fee, which is going into this listing fee account, which we get to choose and configure in the settings, it's being hit or affected as an expense transaction for $755. So the balance between the $250, the $755, which is what makes it to the bank eventually, which is being transferred into the Chase 5150 account, that's the one that shows up in here and is zero as how the transaction reconciles to zero. So in other words, this account will always at some point reconcile to zero. If I click on reconcile on this clearing account, and then I click on, let's say, zero balance, and let's say this is for June 30th, 2021, this account should always reconcile to zero. Okay, once all the transactions are selected, it should just have a zero difference at the end, and that's the purpose of the clearing account. Now, of course, the transfer that goes into the bank account, this 242 and this the other 242. You see there, that gets transferred into the bank account. Bank account gets reconciled sort of by itself, right? But we're not discussing reconciliation of bank accounts. We're talking about the clearing accounts that were created and generated through Synder. Let me go back into Synder here, show you a couple other things. For example, if I want to see just the expense side of the transaction or the transaction fee, I can click on that link and it will open up that specific transaction fee for $7.55. You're about to see it show up in here. We saw it on the register, but now you're seeing it as an expense transaction by itself for $7.55. So it's really, really clear how the data flows into QuickBooks. And again, you have complete control of how that data comes in. Now, a couple other things I want to discuss because I want to make sure you understand how the dynamic of Synder works. In some cases, for whatever reason, these transactions did not sync, right? You can look at them first. You can kind of evaluate whether or not you want that to come into QuickBooks, and you can manually push these transactions to sync simply by just selecting them, okay, all three of them, and then clicking on sync. Click on sync, and that will come into QuickBooks. That will actually force the sync in there, and if you wait just a couple of minutes, of course, the more you do, the longer it takes. They officially all get completely synced in, and now they all show as synced. So those transactions that were previously synced, I had the ability to push that sync in there. Again, sometimes, depending on the transaction type, Synder will push it automatically. Sometimes it kind of needs you to push it in there just to make sure that's a transaction that you want to bring into QuickBooks the way that is coming in. And again, you can click on show details to get into that. Now you will notice on the top right where it says syncs left. Now the way Synder charges, it is based on the number of transactions that you sync in. So the smaller businesses that have less transactions will buy a smaller subscription package. The ones that have a whole bunch of transactions will have a much bigger subscription package. Now I'm going to go to the Synder website real quick and talk into pricing, so you can get a general idea how pricing works. We'll get back into Synder and do more stuff, but at this point, it's valuable that you get a general idea how this works. So for example, the medium account, which does not do product mapping for inventory, I would probably say that's probably one of the biggest things, that product mapping for inventory and some additional support. But from my experience, for inventory tracking, that's really where you would need the large versus a medium. But if you don't do inventory tracking, medium will be good enough. You just pick here whatever your sales volume is, how many sales platforms you're going to have, how many smart rules you want to create. We'll go back into smart rules and explain that in a minute, and whether or not you want to enable invoicing, which I'll also explain in a minute as well. That will give you the pricing. So whatever your sales volume is, however platforms you want to configure, how many smart rules you want, that's going to determine what that monthly fee for Synder is. For a lot of my clients, they're paying a couple $100 a month. I might have one or two clients paying over $1,000, very large e-commerce type businesses. But this is supposed to save you, well, it's going to save you a lot of bookkeeping time, a lot of manual entry time, a lot of reconciliation time. So whatever time this will save you is probably a lot more than what it would cost you manually to fix the mess you can make by having just QuickBooks use the regular syncing methods of each of the platforms, or you entering the transactions by hand. Anyway, let's go back into Synder here and talk about a few other things. So you can also, something I love about this is you can roll things back. So for example, let's say this transaction for $48, I don't want that to be in QuickBooks. So what I can do is I can click on this three little buttons here and then click on rollback. What rollback will do is it will undo the enter of the transaction, pretty much will delete it from QuickBooks, and it'll be as if the transaction never came into QuickBooks. It will undo every single action that Synder took when syncing that transaction. If you want to push it back later on, you can click on the drop-down menu and click on sync, or click on show sync info if you want to see how the data is going to sync, or the history of the syncing anyway. So again, I can sync this again or force that sync in there again. That's an option. So you have complete control over it. The other thing that's pretty interesting too is instead of having QuickBooks Synder create the sales receipt, you can have Synder pay off an open invoice as long as the email or the customer name matches. So for example, let's say this Dan Lagan transaction. I'm going to click on show details for a second just to show you. It created a sales receipt. So I'm going to open it up and show you that sales receipt. Okay, and this is the data that was pushed from Synder into QuickBooks. Now I'm going to roll this transaction back. So I'm going to come back here and click on roll back sync and click OK. That way, Synder pretty much deletes it away from QuickBooks. When I go back into QuickBooks, I'm going to click on refresh, and you will see the transaction will be blank. It's no longer there. It pretty much got rid of it, right? So it got rid of the transaction. So let's say that same transaction, I want it to match to an open invoice. So I'm going to click on new, click on, let's say, on new invoice. I'm going to create a customer. I'm going to call it, let's say, John Day or something like that. I'm just making up the customer name at this point, but I am going to put in the customer email address. I'm going to put the same address I had from the transaction. So I'm going to click on the transaction ID, which is actually going to open the transaction in my platform. So this is a PayPal transaction. It will open the transaction in PayPal so I can look at it. And the reason why I'm looking at it is because I literally want to copy and paste that customer's email into QuickBooks. So I'm going to copy the email here. So Synder recognizes that to be a payment towards that open invoice. Okay, so that should make sense. Now on the invoice number, I'm just going to put a random invoice number here, and I'm going to select a random product here and put here $200. So again, I'm creating an invoice and I'm simulating a QuickBooks user creating an invoice in QuickBooks prior to doing a Synder sync. And I don't want the transaction to be duplicated. I don't want the invoice to stay open and a new sales receipt to be created. So Synder is smart enough that if the email matches, even if the customer name doesn't match, if the customer name matches, of course it will take the customer name. But if the email matches, it will know that instead of creating a sales receipt, it should create a payment towards that open invoice. So see the invoice for $54.54 that was created before, Synder found the transaction and created a linked payment instead. So if I go back into QuickBooks here for a second, and I'm gonna just open up that invoice so we can see it, you will see that the invoice now shows paid. If I click on this link where it says payment made and click on that payment link, it will open up the payment. This transaction was downloaded through Synder. It got booked into PayPal and the PayPal account the way I have it in the settings, but it automatically applied to the invoice. Now, is it perfect? Will it eventually apply payment to the wrong invoice? Yeah, it's possible, but as long as the email and the customer name matches, it should apply it to the right customer. It does get tricky if you got multiple customers with the same email address. Of course, no system's gonna be perfect at that point, but for most e-commerce people, that's not gonna be the case. And in the event that you do create the invoice separately before you do the sync, Synder is smart enough to know that should be a payment and not a sales receipt. So that's really good. Now I'm going to click on import historical data, and this is where you can choose, depending on the platform, how far back you want to go. So I'm going to click on PayPal here, and then I'm going to say, you know what? I want to go back to this whole year. And then I click on import for review, and that's going to bring all the transactions for the year and put them in the screen. It won't necessarily sync them if any new transactions are created. So if I go through the list, you're going to see some transactions are here ready to sync. Again, it automatically syncs some and not others depending on how it recognizes the transaction in your settings. So this import historical data is the one that will help you choose what date range to use. Now, let's say, for example, I want to import an Excel database, a list of transactions I have in Excel. I'm going to download this template here for a second, just so you can see what the template looks like. And what's important about using a template is for you to save a lot of time that it would take if you try to sort of like figure out how to create a sheet that Synder will read. So you can just pick any of these the default tabs that are here, and then make sure that whatever data you have from whatever other source matches this. And as long as it matches this, you'll be able to sync in those transactions into Synder from this spreadsheet. Now notice that, for example, this specific transaction number 2, has two line items in there. That's okay, that's fine. It will bring in transactions with multiple line items as long as the transaction ID all matches the same number. So I'm actually going to save this into my downloads and show you what it would look like to download these transactions from Excel into Synder to go through the full workflow for importing. So I'm going to click here on Browse Files, and I'm going to select my the same template. So I'm going to do it from the same template. I'm going to pick the sheet that I want to import from. Then I'm going to click on Import for Review. So once you do that, all the transactions from Excel that, again, supposedly came from some other platform that Synder doesn't automatically sync, so you have that option. And then we're going to go into Transactions. Then I'm going to click on this drop-down menu here, click on Excel Import, which is one of the platforms we have. And then you're going to notice that all these transactions that were imported through Excel, they're now showing up here. They have not yet synced into QuickBooks. So if I select all these transactions and then click on Sync, it's going to now bring them all into QuickBooks using whatever configuration we have set up. I can also manually sync any of these that I want to. Now I'm going to search one of these. Let's say we have a customer called Thor. I'm going to go back into QuickBooks here and search for Thor, see if we can find that transaction. There it is. I'm going to click on the expense transaction here for $15. And you will notice that this transaction for $15 has been imported. Now, if I go back into Synder here, I get to see these transactions. This happened to be an expense transaction, but there's also another Thor transaction for $36.47. So I go back into QuickBooks, close that, and search for Thor one more time. And then look at my sales receipt. There is my sale that came in through Excel. Now here where it says deposit to, it says Excel import bank account. Obviously that's a made up bank account, not a real bank account. That's all part of the settings. So I go back into settings, and then I go back to configure my Excel import, and I click on sales. I get to choose which bank account those transactions should import into. And if I know that should be going into a specific Bank of America or a specific Chase account, I can choose that and change that configuration. So that's how you do the configuration, how you do the sync, what it looks like on QuickBooks, how you choose how the data comes in, and how you bring the data from Excel. I do want to show you a couple more features that are really groundbreaking, they're really interesting inside Synder, they're worth mentioning. They're a little bit outside of the standard syncing process, but I think they are worth mentioning. Here where it says receive payments, if you go into invoicing, Synder will also sync all your open invoices. And if you have an open invoice in QuickBooks, and let's say, for example, for whatever reason, your customer hasn't paid you already, or you haven't sent the invoice to QuickBooks, you can actually get paid through the Synder platform as long as you have Square or Stripe or one of these payment platforms connected to it. So as long as you have that in there, you can actually send this invoice directly from Synder to the client, or click here in invoice settings, and you can actually choose what the template will look like. So it's really, really interesting how you can do that. There's also payment links. So payment links allows you to create a payment link or a custom payment link that you can just put in your website. So for example, let's say you have a standard service for $50 where somebody can just pay you through in your website. You put $50 here, click on save, and then you have the actual code, the HTML code. You would copy and paste into the website at any point in time. If I click on preview, I can show you what it looks like. You're actually going to see a button that says pay, and if the customer just clicks on pay, they'll be able to enter their information and just pay you directly through it. So on top of the e-commerce standard downloading of transactions that have already been processed, Synder gives you the ability to create custom payment links, so you can kind of plug that and play that into your website and have other ways of receiving income. You can also click on send email, and you can just shoot an email to the client straight from Synder, so you don't have to go into QuickBooks and create an invoice and get payment from there. And if you do that, Synder will synchronize that invoice and that payment and put it all into QuickBooks, so you don't have to do double work. Now, if you already are getting paid through QuickBooks, of course, you don't need this. You can use the QuickBooks process, but it's really, really interesting that you have that. So that's the first kind of interesting feature I wanted to show you outside of the standard e-commerce stuff. The next one I want to show you is this one called Smart Rules. Now, Smart Rules to me are pretty much what makes Synder different than any of the other sort of e-commerce aggregators. And what this allows you to do is take multiple circumstances and bundle them together to get Synder to automatically take a specific action. Now, that action could be adding a particular piece of information into your accounting, or it could be sending an email. Let me show you. I'm going to go ahead and delete this action that we have here. And let's say, for example, that I want this smart rule to automatically add a class to a sales transaction that was brought in from Synder into QuickBooks based on where the payment came from. So if it's a PayPal sale or a Shopify sale or an eBay sale, Amazon sale, whatever it is, I want QuickBooks to add a class or a location. If you click on templates, you would actually see that a lot of these templates are already built in and they're sort of thinking about the QuickBooks user in mind. So if I click on classes, for example, I can say, look, if a particular transaction comes in through PayPal or through Shopify, I want you to automatically set a class, a class for that transaction. So I'm going to click on try it out, and it will kind of write the rule for me. So the rule is created here. So you see here, when a sales receipt is created and no class is set, go ahead and add a particular class. So if I click here where it says set QuickBooks entry data, I can click on the drop-down menu and click on Shopify. So this particular rule will send all, or the smart rule will sell all the transactions to the Shopify class. However, that's not really complete because we need to tell it if it actually comes from Shopify. So I'm going to build it from scratch just to kind of show you. So I'm going to close that all out and show you. So the first trigger is a new sale comes in. So a sales receipt is created. So that's going to be the trigger. So I'm telling Synder, if you create a sales receipt and it comes from Shopify, go ahead and add the Shopify class on it. So I'm going to click on condition here, create the condition, and this is what I tell it. Look, if let's say the payment type, the payment method in this case, is specifically Shopify, so I'm going to put here Shopify. So if the payment method is Shopify, and I'll explain by I mean by that, I'm going to go back into QuickBooks. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to click on the drop-down menu. I'm going to try to find a transaction that came from Shopify. Let me see which transaction came from Shopify. I know one of these big ones, like $9.99, this one for sure, came from Shopify. I'm going to open the sales receipt and notice that I know it came from Shopify because of the payment method. So what I'm telling Synder is, if you're going to create this rule that if you're going to create this sales receipt that comes from Shopify, go ahead and enable this smart rule. So then the action that we're going to tell it to take, we're going to click on action, and then we're going to say the action is, I want you to go back into QuickBooks, and I want you to update this sales receipt. And I want you to update, say the current, that means the entire transaction. Click on set QuickBooks data. And then I'm going to tell it, if this sale comes from Shopify, I want it to be classified as Shopify. I'm going to click on submit, click on save rule. And now from this point forward, any things that I do that are from Shopify, they're going to come into QuickBooks with that class in mind. Now, let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to click on transactions here. I'm going to go ahead and filter my Shopify transactions. Okay, I'm going to undo a couple of these Shopify transactions. So I'm going to roll this one back. So I'm just going to roll back a couple of them. Okay, so I'm just rolling back 3 or 4 transactions here. So they are no longer in QuickBooks. Now I'm going to sync them again. So I'm going to sync this one for $9.99.99. I'm going to go ahead and click on sync. and I'll click on refresh. That should be synced by now. There you go, synced. So when I open up that sales receipt, you will notice that the class is now properly set. Notice that the Shopify class is set. What would that give me? Well, if I run a report such as a P&L by class, I'll be able to see my sales by class. Extremely valuable for e-commerce type platforms. So that one transaction that was synced came in with that. Every single transaction moving forward will have that. So anyway, I wanted to give you a video that's pretty comprehensive to kind of show you what it looks like, what it does. You will need to kind of go through the settings, experiment with all the different options you have in there to be able to really tweak it to make it flow the way you want it to flow. The biggest takeaway about Synder is the fact that all the clearing accounts for the payment platforms that are being used through e-commerce are all going to be self-reconciling. The payment, the transfer, and the expense are all going to come in. So then when you download your transactions from QuickBooks, those transfers, the actual net payment amount that you're getting paid from e-commerce, from those e-commerce platforms, those are now going to be reconciled with your bank when you download those transactions. Now, Synder works with QuickBooks Online, QuickBooks Desktop, and Xero. So it not just works with QuickBooks Online, but this video was focused on QuickBooks Online. So anyway, I hope that if you have an e-commerce business, you take a look at Synder. There are other options out there, but this is the one that I'm currently using, especially based on the current integrations that it has. So if you go through the Synder website, look at the integrations and you use, and all your e-commerce platforms are there, plus the ones that are not there do have an Excel output, you know that Synder is going to be a great choice. You know exactly how it works through this video. So anyway, if I missed something out, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them below in the comments. I will add links to everything I mentioned in the description as well. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one. One last thing. If you do end up subscribing to Synder after watching this video, make sure that you put and copy and paste whatever coupon code I have in the YouTube description of this video. You want to scroll down to where the description is and copy and paste that promo code in there. Those promo codes do change, so you do want to check out the latest one that's in there. Now, once you copy and paste that coupon code in there, whatever discount we have at the moment will be applied to your account. I do not get paid for people that sign up via that coupon because I am a Synder consultant and I bring a lot of my clients into Synder. They give me coupons from time to time so I can pass on those savings to my clients. So anyway, make sure you take advantage of that coupon code so you can get some discount for your monthly or annual subscription of Synder. Good luck.